I've had time to reflect on The Amazing Spider-Man 2 a number of times, and to be perfectly frank, as much as I like the movie, I'm forced to agree with many individuals on a point that cannot be overlooked. Both Sam Gavin of Sam's channel and Confused Matthew themselves have commented on the mistakes that Sony have made with Spider-Man itself, and I am forced to agree with them despite my praise of the movie. There have been cinematic universe franchises before Marvel. There were early monster movies, the Star Trek franchise from the motion picture to Nemesis, etc. What Marvel did was simply popularize or repopularize this filmmaking, and thanks to Marvel's success, other studios are now attempting the same thing with other franchises, comic book or otherwise. The obvious ones being the X-Men series from Fox, the DC series from Warner Brothers, and of course Sony's failed attempt at a cinematic universe with Spider-Man, which we'll get to later. Other cinematic universes have now been announced. Paramount themselves are attempting the same endeavour with the Transformers live-action movies established by Michael Bay. Universal Pictures are now attempting the same with their rebooted monster franchises. And of course Sony are now attempting the same approach with the Ghostbusters reboot that's coming out. And even Dan Aykroyd, who spearheaded the Ghostbusters along with Harold Ramis back in 1984, is himself approving of the cinematic universe of the Ghostbusters series. There is no question Marvel has had a tremendous impact on the film industry as well as popular culture, just like Star Wars and Star Trek before it. Now, a cinematic universe franchise I'm open to the prospect of, since in that context there is an entire world you can craft and explore for yourself, but at the same time there is a greater risk of failure on the part of filmmakers. There is a risk of hype, as there was with the James Cameron movie Avatar, which wasn't a bad movie, but I feel it suffered from too much hype. And I do have this legitimate concern with two movies in particular, Avengers Age of Ultron, and of course the retcon/reboot Terminator Genesis, which are soon to grace the cinema and the box office this year. But getting back to the meat of the matter, the failed Amazing Spider-Man series by Mark Webb. Cinematic universes have been popularized by Marvel as stated before, but I believe and are convinced that this is due to the success of the Avengers Assemble movie specifically, and it's because of that movie that studios are now trying to ride the Marvel coattail, or even trying to best Marvel at their own game. The other companies with film rights to comic book series, specifically the main three, Fox, Warner Brothers, and Sony, have attempted or are in the process of developing cinematic universe franchises for the characters they possess. Sony is the one I will focus on the most. Why? Because of this video. If Sony continued with their original plans to construct a cinematic universe with Spider-Man, would the films have garnered the same acclaim or lukewarm reception as the other films? From the release schedules I've seen, the answer is a yes and a no. For the sake of this video, we are sticking with the schedule that Sony originally had before ASM2 was released and before changes were made. I will also not be talking about the Spider-Man reboot that's to come in 2017 in this video, since that was not part of Marvel's original schedule and was only revealed after Sony had been hacked. Let's begin. Sony had announced 5 films to come after Amazing Spider-Man 2, namely the 2 sequels along with 3 spin-offs, the Sinister Six, Venom, and an unnamed female-centered spin-off film. The female spin-off film's name was never revealed, neither was its schedule, but for the sake of this video, and because of ASM2 having Felicia Hardy in the film, I'll call the film Black Cat for simplicity's sake, as she is the most likely candidate for a Spider-Man spin-off. We already know how Amazing Spider-Man 2 turned out with respect to its competition, namely Captain America the Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy, and X-Men Days of Future Past, so I won't bore you too much with them. All 3 of them outgrossed the Amazing Spider-Man 2 domestically and worldwide at the box office. Confused Matthew in his unfinished Sony commentary highlights the fact that ASM2 was left in the dust, so I recommend checking out that video for more information. Here is a problem with Sony's original plans for Spider-Man. Even if the films were to receive positive reviews consistently, they would be good at the box office, but certainly would not be as good as their competition from other studios. let's take the assumption that each of the Marvel, Fox, and Warner Bros. Future releases have at worst mixed reception and at best critical acclaim. Sony would have tough releases to deal with. The Sinister Six was originally going to be released, if my memory serves me correctly, in 2015, before it's pushed to the year after. Its rival films would have been Age of Ultron and Ant-Man. ASM 3's rivals in 2016 would have been Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice, Suicide Squad, Captain America Civil War, Doctor Strange, Gambit, Deadpool, and X-Men Apocalypse. 2017 would see the release of the Venom movie and its rivals, namely Wonder Woman, Justice League Part 1, Guardians of the Galaxy 2, Thor Ragnarok, and the third Wolverine spin-off. And finally, 2018 would have seen the release of ASM 4, with its competition being Avengers Infinity War Part 1, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, The Flash, and Aquaman. As said before, Black Cat's schedule was never announced, but will operate under the assumption that whatever year it would be released on, it would have the rivals of that particular year. They would be the rivals that the film would have to contend with. The biggest problem, I feel, is that Spider-Man, as he is, has been compounded by two problems. First, franchise fatigue. Spider-Man has certainly outstayed his welcome live-action-wise, or rather I should say, he hasn't been given a proper rest, not to mention the audience has had to sit through 2 origin movies. Spider-Man was definitely rebooted too soon. Second, the reception of Amazing Spider-Man 2. It's a movie that, to those who hated it, only serves to remind them of a movie they saw and hated 7 years prior. Batman has had his rest of at least 8 years after Batman and Robin, which sucked, and Batman Begins itself received critical acclaim upon release. You also had Man of Steel, which came 7 years after Superman Returns, and while Man of Steel had at best a lukewarm reception, it still gave DC a license to continue with their plan for a cinematic universe, even if the audience reception was mixed compared to that of Batman Begins or even The Dark Knight, and even though Superman Returns functioned as a retcon of the Richard Donner Richard Lester franchise, its release years after the panned Superman 4 was a long-deserved rest. My point is, Spider-Man has not been given this same treatment by that of Batman and Superman. I have this feeling that people are sick of Spider-Man. That's one factor I can definitely see. You could argue that the X-Men film series has franchise fatigue, but to be fair, it has had a good revival from mediocrity because of the success of X-Men First Class, and even more so Days of Future Past. And of course the Wolverine had a passable reception. The X-Men franchise's recovery is astounding, considering it's the only comic book movie franchise that didn't require a reboot to stay alive, but instead retconned the franchise and corrected some of the misdoings in order to get back on track. Yes, I know Days of Future Past acts as a sequel to X-Men The Last Stand, and after the time travel it pretty much disregards the original trilogy itself. I'm fully aware of that, but X-Men Days of Future Past is a retcon, not a reboot. Terminator Genisys is similar in function as well, considering the fact that not only does it act as a sequel to Terminator Salvation, I presume, but it will also retcon the franchise's previous films, which were already good anyway. Terminators 1 and 2 being cinematic masterpieces, whereas Terminator 3 and Terminator Salvation were pretty average at best. But the Terminator franchise is another story. Sony hasn't really learnt from any of their mistakes. Plus, Sony doesn't understand why Marvel is successful in crafting a cinematic universe. Say what you will about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I don't care if you're Confused Matthew or someone else who doesn't like the Marvel movies. Marvel at least attempt to build a story with their movies, be they superficial like Iron Man 2 and the Hulk, or masterful like Captain America the Winter Soldier. Whether you want to agree or not, Marvel themselves have a goal, and it's not just a business deal, though that is the case. They have focused on building a cinematic universe from the ground up, so they can tell the stories they want to tell with the characters they have. They have built their cinematic universe slowly and steadily, and while Iron Man 2 was a blatant advertisement for the Avengers and a misstep, the other films, good or bad, have at least focused on story first before setting up the next movie. There are hints, but the films are not commercials for themselves, with the exception of Iron Man 2. Amazing Spider-Man 2, while it isn't so much a setup movie as Iron Man 2 is, Sony nevertheless brazenly rushed into announcing their film projects ahead of time. They didn't take the time to build their universe slowly, and that does show in ASM 2. Despite the fact that I have praised the film for its themes, screenplay, soundtrack, and characters. Despite the credit I give ASM 2, I cannot deny that Sony foolishly rushed into their plans and essentially made ASM 2 a Sinister Six commercial. And yes, you guys probably are pointing to Warner Brothers right now and saying, well, what about Man of Steel? What about them rushing into a cinematic universe project? To be fair, with the exception of Man of Steel, DC intend to include most of their characters, 4 of which have already been announced: Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman, whose costume looks pretty awesome, by the way. Those 4 are pretty much already going to be introduced in Dawn of Justice, and they'll receive their own individual solo movies in the foreseeable future, whereas Marvel instead focused on an individual character first, then brought them together in the Avengers. DC, though its goal is the same as Marvel, they're taking a different approach. But getting back to Sony, even if they continued with their original plans, their cinematic universe would have struggled. It may have been possible for Sony to turn this around and learn from their mistake with ASM 2. Believe it or not, Paramount was in a similar situation with the Star Trek cinematic universe. Both the motion picture and the Final Frontier failed to meet expectations critically. While the motion picture had a lukewarm reception at the time of its release, the Final Frontier has been pretty much panned by the majority of fans and critics alike. Though to be fair, in defense of the motion picture, it did have a very good box office taking, whereas Star Trek V's box office taking was okay, but nothing great. But what happened when Star Trek V and the motion picture failed? Well, what we got was Star Trek II Wrath of Khan and Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country, both of which have received critical acclaim and have been regarded as some of the best Star Trek movies along with The Voyage Home. Both Wrath of Khan and Undiscovered Country managed to keep Star Trek afloat after Paramount's missteps. The film that dealt the major blow to Star Trek was Star Trek Nemesis, which even though it made its budget back at the box office, it still was a commercial failure. Having said that, Star Trek was nearly killed twice before it was rebooted, with the motion picture and with the Final Frontier. But they still had sequels that managed to bring Star Trek out of the dust. It is possible the Sinister Six could have been used to bring the Amazing Spider-Man franchise back from near extinction. Heck, the Venom movie could have done the same thing as well. But alas, it was not meant to be. Granted, even if Sinister Six and the Venom movie, even if both films were praised upon release, they wouldn't have the same box office takings as their rival films. Nor would they have the box office takings to overtake said movies. For every Spider-Man sequel or spin-off, you have another film from another franchise outgrossing it every step of the way. Marvel, Fox, and Warner Brothers have a wider range of characters from several franchises at their disposal, whereas Sony only had the characters from the Spider-Man franchise, and though it may have diverse characters from the Spider-Man universe, Sony would not have the same success that the studios have or will have in the future. As much as I differ with Confused Matthew on the value of making Spider-Man a cinematic universe, I can understand where he is coming from. Both he and Sam have noticed that Fox focused on making a good movie first, namely X-Men Days of Future Past, rather than focusing on building a universe. Sony's focus was the opposite. It focused on building a universe quickly rather than doing it slowly and making ASM2 a great movie that audiences would love and a movie that would stand the test of time. Sony clearly is a studio that doesn't learn, and in light of the fact that it is now trying another cinematic universe franchise, but this time with the Ghostbusters, it proves that they still haven't learned from their mistakes. On a quick side note, Man of Steel did gross slightly less than Amazing Spider-Man 2, but it didn't receive as much hate as Amazing Spider-Man 2 did. Most reviews of Man of Steel, I would guess, were pretty cold, whereas with Amazing Spider-Man 2, it had its reputation dragged through the mud. Similar to how Spider-Man 3 has its reputation dragged through the mud by Spider-Man fans, and how Star Trek Nemesis has its reputation dragged through the mud by Star Trek fans. While it is good news for Marvel fans that Spider-Man can join the Marvel characters on the big screen, what doesn't really give people hope is Sony still having creative control over the Spider-Man films, despite their joint endeavour with Marvel. So my 2 cents on if the Amazing Spider-Man being a cinematic universe working, it's again yes and no. Yes, because Sony could have improved and actually focused on making a film that made people hungry for more Spider-Man projects, and no, because it would not have the same accolades as the Marvel franchise. A cinematic universe with Mark Webb's Spider-Man franchise could have worked had Sony actually took a step back and focused on having a good story to draw their crowd in, rather than just simply trying to compete with Marvel, and now, ironically, they have turned to Marvel for help. Again, I suggest taking a look at Confused Matthew's Sony commentary, and I would also recommend looking at Sam's channel's review of X-Men Days of Future Past. Watch both of them with respect to their comments on Days of Future Past and ASM2, and come to your own conclusions on the matter. But even if it were possible, the plans have been dropped anyway. What's done is done. Spider-Man will return to our screens, rebooted in 2017, and to give a reality check to a lot of fans, no Andrew Garfield donning the suit again. How this Spider-Man movie will turn out, I don't know. Hopefully for those who hated ASM2, it will wash a bitter taste from their mouth. But for all who saw it, whether they liked it or hated it, we'll at least get to see Spider-Man with the other Avengers despite being rebooted. We'll just have to wait and see. Thanks for watching.